Welcome, everybody. I just turned on the recording for this webinar, so just FYI, this is being recorded. We'll make it available to those who can't participate as a video. We'll post to the website later. Thanks so much for signing on to hear John Winsten talk about his experience with Payment for Ecosystem Services program design and some pilot testing that he has done. I think you all probably are familiar with John, and he was at our first meeting. He's going to share some hopefully really useful feedback from his field work and do his best to sort of crosswalk the experiences of the pilots that he has run to some of the questions that are being considered in our working group. Just a little bit of housekeeping, how this platform works. John and I are the only ones who can talk by default. And so if you want to ask any questions, you can, at the bottom of your screen, there is a little raise hand button, which allows me to know that you want to talk, and I can pass you the mic. And you can also ask questions in the chat window or through the Q&A function. So those are the ways to interface, and we will pause at a couple of points throughout the webinar to take some clarifying questions, and then we'll also have a discussion period at the end. And I will hand it over to John. And John, just one note, maybe you could just begin just to sort of tie yourself into the working group a little bit. Jill was asking if you could talk a little bit about your new CIG activity as well. So I don't know if you want to say that as part of your introduction a little bit.
Sure, will do. Okay, well, thanks very much. Welcome, everybody. The upside of being able to do this by webinar is that we waste a lot less time commuting somewhere, and I'll burn a lot less fuel. The part that's difficult for me is speaking to an audience that I can't see. So anyway, if there are questions, I hope that function in the Zoom window will work for you to ask questions. Elizabeth will see them and let me know. So anyway, I'm an agricultural economist. I have been working with a large nonprofit organization called Winrock International for, well, since 2001, so I guess 18, almost 19 years. And I recently have taken a partial step out of Winrock to do some independent consulting work. And under that umbrella of an independent consultant, I am doing starting a new project for NRCS in Vermont through the Conservation-Innovation Grants Program, which is to design a pay-for-performance conservation program. And this is not unfamiliar to me. I've been doing this in different places around the country, and also started with work in Vermont and in Iowa 10 years ago or more. So a little bit about my background. My dad had a dairy farm in Massachusetts and then in the Connecticut River Valley in New Hampshire. So dairy and New England agriculture is really important to me. I currently live in Shelburne, just south of Burlington, and I spend a lot of time on Lake Champlain, and the lake is really important to me also. So while I am working on these issues around the country and in Canada, I'm very happy to be working on them again closer to home. This is really, this is the place where it matters the most to me. So in this presentation, in this webinar, the things that I'm going to try to cover, and I'm going to have to move fairly quickly, a bit of the theory and the concept behind pay-for-performance conservation. I'll talk about some of the design issues and also the pilot testing that we've done in different places with some of the results that we've had. Talk about some lessons learned and maybe leave you with some ideas to ponder. I am very happy to be a resource to the working group as it moves forward, and I hope this will be helpful. I do want to preface my presentation by saying that what I have been working on is really focused on water quality exclusively, and particularly it's been on phosphorus loss reduction. More recently, nitrogen to some extent. I have separately done some work on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, but that's a whole different thing. things. So in this presentation, you'll see and hear that it's very focused on water quality. That's only one of the ecosystem services I think that you guys are interested in, and some of what I've done may be, some of it will be relevant to what you want to do, and some of it may not be. So anyway, just keep that in mind. So as most of you are pretty clearly aware, the current approach for conservation is really a pay-for-practice approach, right? And USDA spends more than $5 billion a year across the US on cost-sharing practices. And basically, the outcomes are not really quantified. I mean, they are in terms of acres and you know, linear feet of buffers and all that kind of stuff, but not really the environmental outcomes or the ecosystem services that we're at. And this approach of cost-sharing practices really doesn't motivate farmers very well to try to use their knowledge and their skills to try to solve the problem. It doesn't really even explain to them very well what the problem is, and it doesn't provide any goals. So it seems to me there's a better way to do it. And I'll say also at this point that the work I've been doing has not been focused on water quality credit creating or private sector markets. It's really more been focused on, can this be used as a more cost-effective and more technically effective way for federal and state governments to spend their conservation dollars? So the reason that for performance conservation is important is that the landscape is diverse. In this particular picture is just an example of, you know, you have flat fields on top, you've got sloping fields going down the side, you've got fields that are very close to surface water. There's probably difference through that landscape, and there's a bunch of characteristics that are going to make some fields more vulnerable than others for nutrient loss. And also, any given BMP is not going to have the same performance or the same outcome on all of these fields. And so using an average, like a coefficient for nutrient loss reduction for a BMP becomes sort of meaningless if the variation is too great. So, you know, we want to use field-specific information, and that's what we do in this pay-for-performance conservation approach. And so what happens here, this is these are infographics that came out of the how shared with the working group that we produced out of one of our projects a couple of years ago. So even though this is numbered 1, 2, 3, as you see, that it really starts with number 2. Science-based models are used to estimate the phosphorus that leaves fields and enters streams. And we also put cost information with that, and we give that information to farmers, and they make the decision on what's the most appropriate and cost-effective thing for them to do on their specific fields. And then in the pay-for-performance part, the farmers get paid based on what the model says their performance is. And we'll talk more about this, the pros and cons of this in a few minutes. I'll say also that it is possible to, while it is not possible to measure at the edge of every field, it is possible to measure in the stream, the mouth of a small watershed. It's somewhat costly, but not impractical to do. And if you can do that, you could also attach an incentive to moving the needle in the stream. And we're going to talk more about that also. That's something that I call model at the farm, measure at the watershed, pay for performance. And that particular concept is one that I entered into the U.S. Nutrient Challenge in 2014, and it was selected as one of a little bit about the economic justification for pay for performance. Essentially what we're dealing with is what in economics we call market failure, okay? And markets imply the existence of prices. And producers and consumers, we all use prices to make our decisions, right? And so when there's not, when prices don't exist, that's one important way that we have market failure. And that is the case with non-point source pollution from agriculture and several other things related to ecosystem services. So the idea with pay for performance is that a performance-based incentive could serve as a price for providing ecosystem services, a price that farmers can line up against and make their decisions. And if they do that, if we're successful in designing something that gets farmers to think about the prices, then the environmental performance from the farm becomes incorporated into their farm business planning. And that's really where we want it to be. That's the most efficient place for it to be, as opposed to some kind of a regulatory approach. So the benefits of this pay-for-performance approach include we're more likely to achieve our outcome and at a lower cost relative to a pay-for-practice approach. And it gives farmers more motivation and more flexibility and the potential for profit. So I think these are really important reasons. In theory, this approach makes all the sense in the world to me. And I have not talked with many or any people who have successfully argued that theory doesn't make sense. In practice, it's another story because it's not easy to do. So I want to talk a little bit about motivation. The reason being that if we can't motivate our farmers to want to provide the ecosystem services that we as a society feel are important, then we're not going to get anywhere. So I want to dig into motivation a little bit. And so this Motivation 101, a little crash course in motivation. So one of the definitions is process that initiates, guides, and maintains goal-oriented behaviors. All of us as humans have a drive generally to reach some kind of clearly defined goal. And the goals need to have, slide's a little bit out, bullet's a little bit out of order. Appropriate goals are often missing from our current conservation programs. As I was saying before, in the sort of cost-sharing practices approach, there really aren't goals that farmers see clearly there. And so when you develop goals in general, they need to have a proximity. So they need to be able to be reached within a reasonable time period. And they need to have an appropriate level of difficulty, not too hard to achieve, but not too easy either. So to dig in a little bit deeper into motivation, there's two different kinds, really. There's intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And the intrinsic motivation, if you can see these bullets, have to do with the internal factors, right? The belief that we can, as individuals, be effective agents of change. Our interest to see how good our performance can get. And if we derive gratification from the challenge of trying to meet the goal. And then the extrinsic motivation is basically seeking an external reward or a payment. There can be competition to be better than others, or there can be coercion to change behaviors, coercion coming from the outside, from others. And these are all relevant, I believe, and I want us to be aware of them. We'll talk a little bit more about them as we go through. Excuse me. So a little bit on the key program design issues. The what, the how, and the where. What ecosystem services do we need? How do we quantify the environmental performance or quantify the ecosystem services? And where do we quantify them? And so we need performance measures, the place where we quantify the performance, that are closely related to the ultimate water quality concern, or if you're thinking more broadly than water, more closely related to the ecosystem service that you're focusing on. And also, the farmers need to see that their management decisions are that they directly influence the ecosystem service or the environmental performance. So this is really important, just to talk about a few examples. If the performance measure were in the lake or the bay or the ocean, that might be where the environmental problem is manifesting itself and where you really want to see change, but that might be too far removed from the farm for any farmer to think, okay, if I make any change, are we going to see any result there? The most ludicrous example that I have come up with in talking about this around the country and in the Midwest in particular, if the performance measure were, for example, the size of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and farmers in Iowa and Illinois were going to get rewarded, get some kind of payment if the average size of that dead zone over the course of a year were to be smaller or to achieve some goal. That might be what we all want to see happen, but the farmers are going to think, well, it doesn't matter what I do. There's way too many other things going on, other confounding factors. So farmers probably aren't going to be motivated to make change. You could have in the river, like for example, a measured load of phosphorus in the Missisquoi River entering into Lake Champlain. So maybe you're closer, or maybe you're in the Rock River or Hungerford Brook or some other place in that watershed. You're measuring in the river, there's maybe a much smaller number of farms involved, but it still might be difficult for farmers to think, okay, well, I could make changes, but my neighbors may not. And so it's going to cost me to make changes, and I'm not going to get any reward because the performance measure is not going to be met. So at the other end of this, measures on the farm. And this is where the stakeholder groups that we have brought together in the past, including in Vermont, we worked closely with Marley Group years back to design some of these things in Vermont. And the group really felt, okay, the performance measures need to be on the farm because the farmers need to understand that if they make changes, it's going to affect the performance measure. So a few words on how do we quantify environmental performance. So, all right, you can have edge of field monitoring, right? And so these pictures on the left, this is a place where we worked in Wisconsin. That's a research station, right? So it's not, obviously it's a lot of money and a lot of work, and it's not practical. But even something smaller like a flume at the edge of a field to capture runoff, it's not really practical that we're going to do that at the edge of every field, and I'm not sure we really want to. You could have in-stream monitoring, where you would have an automated sampler like the ISCO sampler in stream that's taking samples from the water at periodic intervals, and it can detect the flow rate, so it can sample more frequently and during high flow events. That's doable. We have that in some places, but it's still costly and still may be too far from the farm. The other thing, and this again is where our stakeholder groups really gravitated towards, is using simulation modeling at the farm. This is basically using science to take into account the specific characteristics of each field, like slopes and soils, etc., and coming up with a best scientific guess or estimate for what the nutrient loss is going to be and how that's going to change. Are models going to be accurate in most years? No, because it's really driven by precipitation. But, is it going to be directionally correct and in the ballpark? Well, if it's a good model, we hope so. So just think about the pros and cons. If you have measured performance as opposed to modeling, right? You have real data from actual conditions, which everybody is more comfortable with. But then you also have volatile weather, which makes planning difficult, and it can affect the performance of even the best laid plans. So is measurement practical at the farm level, as we were just talking about? Well, probably not at this point, and maybe in the future there will be. I know technology is moving very quickly, so maybe there will be something that can do that. At the moment, I don't really see it yet. And then there's the question, can you use proxy variables? So something that's easier to measure, that's scientifically related to the outcome you achieve. That's possible also. In terms of modeled performance, in my mind, the biggest advantage is that it allows for the analysis of scenarios on a farm and on specific fields before the farmer takes any actions or makes any changes. And so that has real advantages for planning purposes. Is it accurate enough? Well, in any given year, probably not. And over the long term, you know, if it's a good model, I would hope so. Also important that the model be simple enough to use and to understand that there are probably trade-offs between simplicity / ease of use and that of accuracy.
John, do we want to pause at this point to, or maybe you can finish this sort of comparison between measuring and modeling, but maybe we'll pause in a moment to ask for clarifying questions or just.
I think that's a great idea. Let me get through 2 slides very quickly that are on the subject, and then we'll pause for questions.
Perfect.
So just a bit of a reiteration here that, you know, with modeling, as you see on the left there, you have more certainty for the farmer, right? No matter what the weather does, the model has told you what the performance is going to be if you make changes X, Y, and Z. But you have greater uncertainty with regard to the actual ecosystem service provision or the environmental performance. And then in terms of measurement, you know, you've got greater certainty with what's happening with regard to the environment, but you've got more uncertainty for the farmer because of crazy weather. And then just, you know, thinking about modeling, the desirable characteristics is that, you know, the model obviously needs to be based on sound science and reasonably current science. Ideally, the model would be flexible, and when I say that, what I mean is, you know, if it can only look at 3 different BMPs, then it's not very flexible. A model that gives farmers greater choice, because again, if you're using modeling for to measure performance, if the model can't quantify it, then it's not in the choice set for the farmer. It should be user-friendly. Ideally, if it could do rather than just one thing like phosphorus, as the Vermont Phosphorus Index or the other state phosphorus indices do. If it could do multiple ecosystem services, and ideally if it could have a wide geographic applicability, so you don't have to have different models in different places. I think that's good. So I'll pause here. This is a paper that I could share with anyone who's interested. We did 8 or 10 years ago about quantifying performance. So let me stop and ask if there are questions.
Thanks so much, John. And also in a moment, we're going to be jumping to John talking about some of his empirical experience that bears some of this out, but we just want to make sure everybody is coming along with the sort of conceptual framework that John laid out and some of this conversation, particularly around these modeling questions or anything else that has been discussed so far. You can ask via chat or the Q&A function, or if you raise your hand, which is a little button at the bottom, you can actually talk if you want. Any questions from anybody?
I'd be happy to hear any human voices other than mine and Elizabeth's, but I'm fine if that's not the case.
And maybe, John, while people are pulling together their thoughts, one question that I hope could be helpful. You know, I think one of the things that the working group has talked about is the way that performance offers more flexibility and maybe more reward for farmers, but it also sort of puts a little bit more of the risk on farmers, obviously. And do you see that some of the modeling and sort of scenario planning can help mitigate some of that risk, or can you just talk about that relationship a little bit?
I do think that, you know, when using models, it takes a lot of the risk out of it for the farmer, because if, you know, they can know their performance before they make any change. But as I said, there's other kinds of risk involved in that. So in terms of, you know, the connection between what they do and the environment.
That's part of the trade-offs.
Yep, right? Yep. For the sake of time, should I keep moving forward, or have you?
Yeah, I don't see any questions from any folks. If you come up with one, we can always pause it at another point also. And
Elizabeth, let me ask you a question. Is there actually anybody listening?
Oh, yes. We've got 9 people on.
All right, sounds good.
Yeah.
So a little bit more, some additional program design questions. What do we pay for? And this was talked about in the first working group meeting that I attended in Waterbury a few weeks ago. Reduced losses versus what I call stewardship levels. If you pay for reduced losses, it's less fair to the farmers who have been doing a lot of conservation all the way along. And it also can impute value into more vulnerable lands, right? Because it's going to be probably, there's going to be more options, and it might be cheaper to reduce phosphorus losses from a sloping field that's vulnerable near surface water than it is from a less vulnerable field. However, that's much more cost effective, right? I mean, if what you're looking for is getting the greatest bang for the buck, you probably want to think about paying for reduced losses. Paying based on stewardship levels is inherently more fair in that it rewards folks for doing all the conservation they've been doing for years or decades. And it imputes value into less vulnerable land and into maybe more appropriate production systems. And that's great. But you need to recognize it's less cost effective, and it may not get us to our goal as quickly, right? Can we have both, paying for reduced losses and stewardship levels? We can, and we did that in Vermont. And you know, it just needs to be designed carefully, and the pros and cons need to be recognized. How much do we pay, right? So this is sort of a general question because we don't even know what we're paying for yet, but just in general, setting the appropriate incentive level is a really important thing to do. In my mind, if you're paying somewhere between more than the cost to farmers to make the change and less than the value to society of the outcome, there's usually a pretty big range in there. And if you're somewhere in between, both parties, the producer and the consumer in this case of the ecosystem service, is going to be better off than they were before. This is the beauty of markets. And you don't necessarily need private sector markets to get this kind of consumer and producer surplus, which is how economists would describe it. So where will the funding come from for a pay-for-performance approach? And this is a question that I used to get all the time. I don't so much anymore. But as I mentioned, there's $5 billion a year or more that the federal government is spending on conservation programs every year, and the states all kick in money. So there's already quite a bit spent. There are regulated entities downstream or wherever. There are, you know, works in carbon markets also, right? There's regulated entities. There's the California Cap and Trade Program, and there's farmers who sell carbon credits into that market. And there's private sector investments that could come in. So that's all I'm going to say for design for the moment. And let me switch into talking about work on farms in different places. If you can see behind these two guys, that's an Iowa State University truck. This is work we were doing in Iowa. Elizabeth, let me know if my sound quality isn't so good. Getting my unstable internet connection.
Yeah, there has been a little bit of freezing. I couldn't tell if it was only for me or for others. Are others having John kind of choppy? He can call in by his phone so that his voice, let's see, do we have any? Sonia says she hears most of it. I think we're okay for now. Let's keep going. And if it gets problematic, we will switch.
All right. I've been called a lot of things. Choppy isn't usually one of them, but I can understand that. So anyway, hopefully you guys can hear me. I'm sorry that I can't see you to know if you can hear me. What we do in our pilot testing of pay-for-performance conservation is we work with farmers who are interested. We voluntarily come forward, identify actions for specific fields. These are the scenarios that we look at. We only really want to talk with them about things that they're actually might be interested in doing if the price were right. There's no point in modeling something or even talking about some change that they just don't ever want to do. Right? So we use modeling tools to estimate the nutrient loss reductions, and we also estimate the costs to the farmer, the full economic costs. And we provide information for farmers to see. So the information created for farmer decision making. For each scenario, the farmer gets a table and graphs that show nutrient loss reduction, the payment they would get from the program, the full economic costs to them, and the profit or loss for each scenario. And ideally, they use this information to decide what changes, if any, they want to make. So I only show this table sense for what we give to them, and I've blacked out the field names, so you know, for confidentiality reasons. I don't want to talk about the specific numbers, but across the top, you can see that each row is a scenario. So there's the acres, the P loss reduction, the N loss reduction, the sediment loss reduction, the cost to the farmer, the payment, and the profit loss in total, as well as the profit loss per acre. So there might be fields that are duplicates. There's no-till plus cover crop, and then there's a change in tillage time. This is generally, instead of fall tillage, going to spring tillage, and in combination with cover crop. So some of these are mutually exclusive, so they can't choose them all, and they choose some. The same information we give to them in graph form. Some farmers prefer it in table, some in graph. These are the top ones, the phosphorus loss reduction, each scenario. So on this farm, there were 30-something scenarios that we looked at. These are changes on fields. And as I said, some fields might be repeated in there. And there's the N loss reduction. So they can see the reductions. They may or may not care about those, and that's fine. The next set of graphs, and these are all corresponding to the same scenarios. That's why they're stacked on top of each other. Here you have the payment that they would receive on the top. In the middle is the total costs to them. Again, the full economic cost. And when I say full economic cost, I mean we include the opportunity cost. So if they were putting in a buffer, for example, they're taking some land out of production. What were the yields of what crops on that specific field that they would make profit on? And they're no longer making profit on it because it's now a buffer. So that would be the opportunity cost in addition to any out-of-pocket or direct cost.
John, can I jump in to ask
Yep.
2 quick questions?
Yep.
One is Jill is asking, are payments guaranteed even if expected results are not achieved, for one thing? And then second, if I could just ask you to just sort of illustrate the significance of these graphs. It's hard to see the details of the graphs, but I think part of the point that you're trying to make is about the variability. But will you just sort of say a little bit explicitly the takeaways from these graphs after talking about Jill's question about whether payments are guaranteed?
Sure, sure. And so in our pilot testing, the way we have structured it, they are guaranteed if the change was implemented in the way it had been described and signed up for. And that's part of the beauty, again, of using models, right? Is that the actual reduction of phosphorus, for example, in this case, may not have been achieved because we might have gotten the 500-year rainstorm that we seem to get every 5 years now or something. But that, we don't want the farmer to be penalized for that. So what the model says is their performance, and they're guaranteed that payment. In terms of what's going on in these graphs, and again, I don't really want to talk about the specific numbers. This is just an example of what we give to the farmer. And I want you to understand that each one of these bars is a scenario. It corresponds to a row in the table that I showed in 20 bars. And so they can see, and you know, while you can't read it or know what those scenario names mean at the bottom, that's the farmer will know, and the technician working with them will know.
John, we have one other question that has asked, which says, these many scenarios, can you comment on possible use of Vermont farm prep models similarity with scenarios for P reduction?
Yeah, I'm hoping to see it soon, so no, I don't yet really. Was that the question?
Sorry, you froze a little bit. Could you say that again?
I haven't seen or used farm prep yet. I'm hoping to. And so I don't know how close. I do think it's related because with this work from our Ohio project, we have been using the nutrient tracking tool model. Both farm prep and nutrient tracking tool, or NTT, are based on the APEX model. So they're sort of siblings or cousins. So they're probably similar.
Got it.
Okay. This is from our Ohio project where we're currently working. And this is what I just wanted to show here is, again, not to have you read the whole thing, but we use a one-page sign-up form. We try to keep it real simple for the farmers. Now keep in mind, this is the pilot testing grant-funded project. It's not a full-blown program. So the people implementing a full-blown program need to decide if something like this would be, if they'd be able to do something so simple. But this basically just tells them, you know, it tells them the pounds of reduction that they're going to get if they make the changes that they signed up for and what the payment's going to be. And then it has some conditions there, which I won't go into in detail, but they're fairly straightforward. I can talk more about them at another time if people are interested. So let me talk a little bit about some of the results. These are results across farms. And this particular graph happens to be from Vermont farms that we worked with 10 years ago up in the Missisquoi River watershed. And what's happening here is each of these vertical colored bars is an actual scenario that we looked at on an actual farm. And this is across a set of farms that we worked with. And there's a few things I want to say about this graph. You can see a horizontal line at the $25 per pound of phosphorus loss reduction. That's what the vertical axis is, cost per pound of phosphorus loss reduction. We were offering farmers $25 per pound of phosphorus loss reduction. So any of these bars that are at or that are below that $25 line, in theory, are good business decisions for the farm to do. According to our calculations, it would make the farmer better off. They would have more in their pocket after doing them and getting the payment than they had before. Some other things I want to say about this graph is that you can see that we truncated it at the $100 per pound level. And the reason we did that is, one, because above $100, well, we're getting into an area that's just maybe not cost effective enough. And so also you can see the texture of this graph on the way down. But what's interesting to note here is that there's huge variability. You know, it's not like one BMP is all clustered in one end of the graph and one in the other. Looking at the rightmost bar, the yellow one, that's a cover cropping scenario that if we didn't truncate this graph would go up over $800 a pound. And when I saw that, I said, well, what's going on there? And dug into it a little bit. And the fields that had been chosen for cover crop by the farmer were ones that didn't have high soil phosphorus and weren't very sloping and maybe not close to surface water, although I don't know that. There just wasn't a lot of bang for the buck, but yet you still had the cost of the seed and getting the seed in the ground and all the other costs of doing cover crop. So not a lot of bang for the buck there. There's a yellow bar sort of in the middle that goes up to $29. That was the most cost-effective cover cropping strategy that we looked at. And the ones that are really close to the zero line, those really had zero cost, and we just show them so you can see that they're there. But there are some changes that for our calculations had no costs. And you're going to get things like this in when you start digging into scenarios. There's costly, and there's ones that save the farmer money. I guess I'll say quickly, the leftmost bar, that was on a farm in Vermont on a dairy farm, where every year, for every field that was going into corn that year, the farmer would put down 200 pounds of 20-10-10 fertilizer. On some of their fields, they had high soil phosphorus. They didn't need extra phosphorus. And in the 20-10-10, obviously there's 10% phosphorus. So the technician and the farmer together came up with the idea that the farmer, instead of 200 pounds per acre, would put down 50 pounds per acre over 20-10-10, and then use urea to make up the difference for the nitrogen needs for the corn. And the urea obviously has no phosphorus in it. That change saved the farmer a little bit of money. Not very much, but some. But then when you sweeten the deal with the $25 per pound payments, it becomes sort of a no-brainer. And this is the kind of tweak that doesn't come out in our current programs, and that yet pay for performance brings these kinds of things to the front, which I think is great. I'm not going to say much about this graph, except to say in the same project we worked with Vermont farms, we worked with Iowa farms too. And so we did a very similar thing. You can see the bars are all a lot shorter. And because we had limited money in our program, we were paying farmers there $10 per pound of phosphorus loss reduction. You know, the differences are, of course, it's different soils, different production systems, but also we were using the Iowa phosphorus index there and the Vermont phosphorus index in Vermont, and they're not the same. So that's probably why the bars have different heights also.
John, a couple questions came on those bar graphs. And this, I think your second graph partly answered this from Jill, but she asked, looks like feed management is the most cost-effective practice. Has anyone done a larger scale cost-benefit study on this? So I think maybe the second graph sort of, you know, complicates that or problematizes that a little bit. And then Sonia asked, what are the types of field measurements that need to be done before modeling out the individual P reductions on each farm? So if you want to just
repeat that last one again, Elizabeth?
Yeah. What are the types of field measurements that need to be done before modeling out the individual P reductions on each farm?
Right. So in terms of the changes in feed management, I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, you know, there used to be, I think, more opportunities for reducing phosphorus in the ration because there used to be extra phosphorus you could just pull out in the minerals. And now if you have a least cost ration, then if you're changing that around, you probably no longer have a least cost ration, so that incurs a cost to the farm. I won't say more about that because it's not my area of expertise really. In terms of field measurements, good question. The models, well, you need the soil type and the slope. And a lot of the models just can get that for you automatically now when you outline the field in the model. It goes and it pulls the Sergo data layers, etc. But what's really important to get, the one thing I would say to answer that question is current phosphorus, soil test phosphorus. You need to know that if you're dealing with phosphorus issues. So let me keep moving forward because I'm a little concerned about time. This table that you're looking at now is basically the results of the good business decision. So if I go back to this graph, if in Vermont and here in Iowa, the farmers did all of the changes that cost them less than the amount they were going to get paid, and only those decisions. And that's not what happened because farmers have different preferences and maybe want to do things for other reasons than just that payment. But if they did those and only those, that in Iowa, they get close to a pound of phosphorus loss reduction per acre per year across the entire farm, not just the fields that they were making changes on. And a net savings in Iowa of 61 cents, so negative cost there. And then we were paying them $10 per pound of phosphorus, so the farm profit was $10.61. In Vermont, it was different. It was about a quarter of a pound of reduction, a cost of almost $5, and a profit then, since we were paying farmers $25, as you will recall, then the profit to the farm was around 20. I'm not sure how useful this information is, but for me, it was interesting to understand, to sort of gauge what the potential is. In reality, it's going to be different because farmers aren't going to they're not going to do all of the things that are good business decisions and only those things. I'm trying to show you that we're doing the same thing currently in Ohio. The only things I want to say here is that we're now in Ohio paying not just for phosphorus, but for nitrogen reductions also. This old woman creek runs directly into Lake Erie, where they have terrible algal bloom problems. We're using the nutrient tracking tool, which I mentioned a minute ago, NTT, which is a cousin or a sibling of Farm Prep, because they're both based on the APEX model, which is a widely used farm simulation model. We take the information from NTT and we paste it into this cost analysis tool so that we can streamline the process of calculating the costs and be able to do analysis on it. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Excuse me. One other comment I want to make here is that you can see in the key in the bottom here that the BMPs are sometimes combinations, right? You can see the orange is change, tillage, and cover cropping together. And there's rotation change and CC, which is cover cropping. Ideally, it's best if you disaggregate these into individual BMPs so you can know where you're getting the bang for the buck. As a researcher, I really want to see that in reality, it's a lot more work for the technicians to have to model them all individually and then model them together. And so in this project, we didn't disaggregate. One other thing I want to say is that this type of graph that I've been showing you, this bar chart, can be misleading because on the left where you see things that are highly negative in the cost per pound, you think, oh, that's great. If you look at the top of this graph, you see that it's the cost effectiveness is dollars per pound of reduction. And so if you have a negative cost and a very small pounds of reduction, it's going to make that number much more negative. So it can be deceiving. In realizing that, we have gone to this scatter plot graph so that you can see, I'm sorry, you can see here, you know, more clearly what we're looking for here, where we're having the cost per pound on the vertical axis and the reduction per acre, phosphorus and nitrogen reduction per acre on the horizontal graph. You're looking for things that are lower on the graph, they'll cost less. And the ones to the right are going to have greater reductions per acre. So it's just another way to look at it that I think is a little bit more useful. The tool mentioned created for the Ohio project can do lots of analysis for us, which is very helpful. This just looks at so 5 farms, we can list them out and see what, you know, their numbers look like. There's cost per pound and there's profit loss. So that's interesting. And the reason it says profit focus there is because, as I mentioned before, there can be multiple fields that have different scenarios on them, and they can't, maybe they're mutually exclusive. You can't do 2 different things on one field sometimes. And so we use the cost analysis tool to choose the one that has the greatest profit for the farm. Or we could have it choose the one that has the greatest reduction. Anyway, not too important. This cost analysis tool can also look at it by BMP for us. And again, some of these are lumped together, but it's an interesting thing to look at. And I've really found this valuable. I'm glad we created it. I'd like to create one for Vermont in the coming months or years. So some of the lessons learned from all of this for us. There is low-hanging fruit out there still, meaning that there are cost-effective changes that can be made to reduce nutrient loss from farms, at least. Especially if you consider these to the costs from other sources, like from developed land or from wastewater treatment plants. They have much higher costs. So there are the possibilities for low cost from agriculture, and that provides greater opportunities for the potential for trading also. Performance-based incentives can inspire new ideas and innovative ideas and get the farmer thinking about how can I find the most appropriate and most cost-effective thing for my specific field, which I don't think the current programs necessarily do for most farmers. Really importantly, farmer motivation varies a lot. And it not only varies within a watershed, as you could expect. You've got the folks who are really into conservation and some folks who aren't as much. But in general, in different places, it's different. We're having trouble in our Ohio project, even though the farmers who are participating are getting some pretty big payments to get other farmers to come forward. And that has hampered our project there. And that's why the motivation piece, it's a tough nut to crack, but it's a really important one. The boots on the ground, so the technicians, is essential. I mean, obviously it's essential. We need someone who can be doing this with the farmers, but we also need really trusted people and skilled people to be in this role. And you know, those people are spread pretty thin. So this is something we need to think about also. Obviously, the transaction costs need to be less than the program benefits. What this means is, you know, if it costs too much to get the technicians to have their time to run these models, if you're doing it that way, or just to run the program, if it costs more than the social value of what you're getting, it probably doesn't make sense. And then models, you know, they seem to be a necessary evil, right? Nobody really likes them because they are a black box, generally. You got to put good information in. You don't really know what happens in there, and hopefully you get good information out the other side. But I do think it takes science and it applies it for us, and I think that's important. And then I just also want to say that policy change is very slow, right? And we've been working on this for a long time, and in Vermont right now, policy change is fast, and we're having a tough time keeping up with it, right? You guys in the working group have a tough timeline, but it's sort of all of a sudden. So what are some of the critical needs? I think we need more water quality monitoring stations in the critical places at the mouths of some of the watersheds. And I think it's really important. I'll talk about that more in a minute. We need modeling tools that are efficient to use, that are scientifically robust, and ideally that address multiple ecosystem services, because you don't want to have to use 3 different models for 3 different ecosystem services. That's not going to be very efficient. We need enhanced farmer motivation, as I've mentioned, and we need to really think about how to get that. And we need the available technical assistance. So let me just try to wrap up here. I'm sorry, I know we're getting short on time. Ideas to ponder for the working group. The cost effectiveness versus fairness issue. I talked about it a little bit earlier. There's not an answer to this. It's an ongoing issue that just exists, and we need to figure out how to take it on. If you have a constrained budget, it becomes more critical. If you have a constrained budget and a goal to meet, an environmental goal, well, you might need to lean more towards cost effectiveness. I don't know. The model at the farm, measure at the watershed approach. I want to say a few more words about this because I think it's got some potential value. And then I want to talk about tweaks versus transformations a little bit. At the watershed approach. Okay, so I shared this info earlier. We talked about the number 1, 2, and 3 are about the modeling at the farm level and making payments based on the modeled results. You can do that and also measure if you had good monitoring at the mouth of a small watershed, for example, where it's mostly agricultural and you have participating farms upstream. You could give a bonus payment to farmers if you move the needle, if you hit a specific goal or target, and that needs to be created with good science also and what's achievable. But there's some real advantages to having that entry goal and making a bonus payment based on it. One is that you have a focal point in the stream, and you can see if your actions are making a difference, and folks want to see that. You can get farmers who are participating perhaps to be interested to talk to their neighbors to say, hey, you should think about participating. We're trying to move the needle down there. And that might be more than any farmer can bring them. So the modeling triggers, the primary incentive payment, as I've been describing earlier, and then the measurement at the watershed level provides a focal point, a real report card. It triggers a secondary incentive payment and the farmer-to-farmer peer pressure, as I just mentioned. Let me just finish with a little bit on tweaks versus transformations, because I know this is important in the group. So I think their environmental improvements can be made on every farm, no matter where they're at, if the farm is interested to do so. Some it's going to be easier than others. But tweaks are more what I've been describing, simple field and crop management changes to reduce phosphorus loss, for example. That's a tweak. A transformation is a restructuring of production system to improve soil health and produce a whole set of ecosystem services, which I think some people in the working group are talking about. Maybe all of you, I don't know. They're very different. It's hard to get transformation. Ideally, both tweaks and transformations would improve the farm's bottom line, but probably are going to have some costs to the farm. And so, if they have costs, then the payments might need to be ongoing, ad infinitum, or the change is going to go away. I don't know. If it improves the farm's bottom line, then maybe the payments don't need to go on forever. I think you guys have received this document by email. It's a how-to guide on pay for performance that we put together a couple of years ago. If anyone doesn't have it and wants it, I can send it to them, and I'll just put my contact information up there if anybody wants to get in touch with me at any time. So we don't have too much time for questions, but let me stop here and ask for any.
No, that's great. And if folks want to stay on for a couple of minutes, if John is available too, we can.
Sure.
We don't have a hard stop at one. John, just so one thing that Jeff mentioned that's just sort of informational, which is good, is that this model at the farm, measure at the watershed model, for lack of a better term, is he says this is the USDA SEEP project that was mentioned at the working group meeting. And Jeff, I don't know if you want to, if there's more to elaborate on that. Jeff, I just allowed you to talk if that's helpful, although you're muted. Is there anything else that you want to say about that, just to make sure that working group members understand the connection?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So it's just a comment, because we started talking about that SEEP project that's starting up in the Dead Creek and Little Otter. But John, it just strikes me that that's exactly what that is they put in gauging and monitoring stations at the outlet of that watershed. And then there's going to be specific modeling within the watershed, probably using that farm prep tool and other tools. And so I like that. I'm just commenting that fits that exact same model.
That's great. I look forward to learning more about that.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks.
And John, Neil is just asking you to comment on the scale of watershed that you're talking about and what constitutes a small watershed, for example.
Yeah. Good question. I mean, there aren't hard and fast rules around this. We've been working in what are called HUC 12s, so the hydrologic unit code, right? So like the Missisquoi is a HUC 8, and the Rock River, if I'm not mistaken, is a HUC 12 within the Missisquoi. And so, I don't know, we might be talking 20 to 40,000 acres, something like that. Again, no hard and fast rules, but the bigger it is, the more difficult it might be to move the needle. Or I feel like there's a percentage of farmers and acres, particular percentage of acres that you need to be making change on if you hope to see a signal in the measurement in the stream.
Neil, does that address your question? not a threshold number, but and Neil's saying he would contend we need to go smaller.
Yeah, I mean, there's pros and cons, right? It'd be easier and more effective to do smaller, but you need more monitoring stations, and those cost money. DEC seems to really be on board with trying to do monitoring wherever is feasible, and I want to talk with them more about that. I hope the working group will also.
So there's been a lot that we've covered, a lot of ground here. Any other questions for John? This is really helpful. And John, maybe again, while people gather their thoughts, do you have any just sort of observations about taking the learnings from this kind of experience, which is more focused on nutrients, to, you talked about this somewhat, but to a more comprehensive model that talks about soil health, where it's, like orders of magnitude more variables and sort of more complicated, but I think there might be some transferable lessons as well. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's really important. Thank you for asking that question. What we've been doing, focused on phosphorus loss from ag land, is pretty reductionist in a way. And I think that, like everything, there are pros and cons. I feel like because this is pay for performance is a new concept, it's helpful for us to have one area of focus and be able to move forward with that. And again, this is where the tweaks versus transformations come in. You need to think also about getting farmer participation and what is the real interest currently for farmers in making any changes like tweaks, and what is their interest in making transformative change to their production system to improve their soil health and generate a whole series of ecosystem services. You need to think about that participation. I think also the complexity of being able to quantify through modeling or measurement these different ecosystem services. and how the payments are going to map to different ecosystem services. It can become at least multiplicatively complex, if not exponentially so.
Yeah.
So I understand the viewpoints of we don't want to be reductionist, and I also can understand viewpoints of, well, let's make sure we can crawl before we try to walk or run.
Thanks, John. Jill, I've just added you in. You had raised your hand to ask a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. Thank you, John. I really appreciated something you said quite early on about the
I was going to try to keep it brief.
No, sorry. Yeah, the formula, like the measurement of the benefit is the, there's the direct benefit to the farmer, which means they're going to break even or do better, right? And then what they've been doing before by behavior change. And then the other formula is the measure of the benefit to society. And those are really two different things, And so, generally we've been trying to persuade farmers to implement these practices based on you're going to break even and help water quality, or you're going to do better economically and help water quality, and with the public benefit part being really a premium on top of that. And as we sort of analyze value or price, it seems like we need to look at those two benefits. I appreciated that distinction that you made in your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. And it's an important point that you bring up right there. The valuation of ecosystem services is something I have never really spent a lot of time on. What's the value to society of this? There are ways of doing it, and there are economists who specialize in that. To some people, it seems like voodoo a little bit. I mean, it's really hard to put a number on it that's meaningful. And yet, we have constrained budgets and we need to make change. So, I feel like there's a lot of room in there for a middle ground of something that can make farmers not only a little bit better off, but enough better off to motivate them to want to do change. And not such a high price that breaks the bank, whatever that means, for the budget constraint of a program.
Thanks, John. Sorry, I don't think I made sure we got to this earlier. Nancy's asking if you can talk about the plans for your CIG grant.
Yeah, so this is interesting, right? Because it is in some ways parallel to the working group. However, we proposed to do something much more reductionist. It's something along the lines of what I've been describing to you. And I don't mean do it like this is what we're going to do. We're going to design something that focuses on nutrients and water quality. I'm very happy if the stakeholders who we're working with want to broaden that out, and we can see clearly how to deliver something to NRCS, the Vermont office of NRCS, that can be useful to them. We want to help them take the first steps in this direction. And we're planning to pull together and have already started to tap some folks to have a stakeholder/science advisory team, right? We need farmers because they need to help design this so it works for them. We need scientists because we need to understand the realities of what's going on between the farm and the environment. And we need to come up with the best way to move forward. It's similar to what the working group's doing. But I guess it depends where the working group comes out and if it's in line with what we have proposed to do. So the other part of our SIG project is something that has to do with transformations. We're just finishing up a paper now, and the project work is going to be based off of that. Just in a nutshell, I'll say, it's how can you coordinate the public monies that already exist to address ecosystem services from farming. And we're specifically focused on dairy for this. How can you combine the public monies with private sector monies for not only funding incentives, but also helping to provide financing for farmers who really want to make transformative change? And the reason we're talking about transformative change is because the dairy industry has been suffering so badly for the last 5 years that we feel that we need to help farmers who are interested change their production system to one that is financially resilient so that they can survive, and that also produces a flow of ecosystem services. So that also is in line with what I've been hearing from the working group.
Thanks, John. There's one other question which might open a can of worms, and luckily we're hopefully we'll be lucky to have John sort of, you know, accompanying us at some future working group meetings. But let me put this question out here and we can see if it can be addressed at some level here, which is that Sonia has asked. We've talked about it some in meetings, but are there specific pre-existing models that you would recommend for such a PES program in Vermont, and what are the first steps it would take to make one here? You know, just that small question.
Can you clarify, when you say models, do you mean like an approach for this kind of a program, or do you mean simulation models that could be used at the farm level?
Sonia, I just made it possible for you to talk. There we go.
Okay, yeah. I was thinking specifically like simulation models.
Right. So the farm prep tool, you know, I've yet to use it and try to do some assessment of it. I'm hoping that it's going to be the tool that is most helpful for us to use. The nutrient tracking tool, I think they looked at and found it to be too cumbersome and decided to do something different and create farm prep. But that's something we're going to dig in quite a bit in our CIG project to try to understand as part of our design and our recommendation that we create. What model or models can we use? Thanks for that question.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just mindful of the time. I think I'm going to wrap this up, but like I mentioned, I think we're going to have an ongoing conversation with John over the course of this working group process. Thank you all for coming and listening in. John, thank you so much. This has been a really helpful conversation, to be continued. And we will be making this recording available on the PES working group website very shortly. So John, do you have any final remarks you want to make before we sign off?
I'll just say thanks for listening and participating, and I am planning to be as present for the working group meetings and as a resource. I'm happy to answer any questions or share any info that I have.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon. Thanks. Bye-bye.